And we're really happy to have Emily Bender with us today. So Emily is a professor from University of Washington, and she has written some very influential papers recently. My favorite is the Climbing Towards NLU paper from ACL 2020. I think that I can highly recommend you read that paper, and it raises a number of very interesting questions. I also really like the Stochastic Parrots paper, which I'm guessing we will hear more about today. Highly recommend that paper too. But now I leave the word to you, Emily. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining this and for accommodating my time zone by starting a bit later in yours. The sun is up here, so that's a good start. I will share my slides with you, and hopefully someone will tell me if that's not visible. Good, great, thank you. The slides are available to you at that bit.ly link there. That's important because some of the citations in my slides are actually not in the original paper. So those citations are available in that PDF so that you have the full bibliography. And then of course, for the rest of the references, you can see the extensive bibliography in our original paper from FACT. So what I am presenting on today represents joint work with a total of 7 authors. So the listed authors on the paper are Timnit Gebru, myself, and Angelina McMillan-Major. Timnit and I are joint co-authors. Margaret Mitchell shows up as Margaret Schmitchell. And then we are also reporting on the work of Vinod Kumar Prabhakaran, Mark Diaz, and Ben Hutchinson. And they were not able to keep their names on the paper because of the story that you probably know, but that I will also tell in this talk. And so just wanted to take a moment to put in some references to more of their excellent work. I think it's really an unfortunate aspect of this that they are not getting the credit for the work that they did sort of officially on this paper. So that slides link is there. It'll come back twice more in the presentation, but I'm not going to keep it busying all the slides. So I'll give you one more moment to note it, and then I will go on to the next slide, which is, I wanted to give you the history and context of this paper a bit. It's a paper that you have probably heard of, even if you haven't read it, and if you have read it, you probably also heard of it in the news before you read it. And so it sort of sits in a strange place for an academic paper. And so I wanted to try to situate it as just a plain old paper to tell you what it was we were trying to do. And it actually started off as a Twitter DM conversation between Dr. Timnit Gebru and myself on September 8th of 2020. She wrote to me asking if I knew of any papers or had written any papers looking at ethical considerations of large language models. And this is also just to give a bit more context, September 8th of 2020, where I live, we had been working from home for 6 months at that point with no return to office in sight, and has sort of like adjusted into different uses of our time, which is an important detail because that's part of how this paper ended up getting written in a month. So I wrote back and I said, sorry, I haven't. Interesting story though, I was approached by OpenAI to be one of their early academic partners, had the meeting with them. The only thing we could think of that would be of research interest to us, me and my PhD student, would be to work with them to try to create a data statement for GPT-3, despite how daunting that might be. And a data statement is a structured documentation of what's in a large data set, or any data set. They said that didn't fit the parameters of the program they were inviting us to. So I'm back where we ended in the data statements paper, and that's Bender and Friedman 2018, where we said, that said, as consumers of data sets or products trained with them, NLP researchers, developers, and the general public would be well advised to use systems only if there's access to information we propose should be included in data statements. So I'm telling Timnit that I'm actually quite worried about the lack of documentation of these things. Oh, sorry, don't mind on that one yet. And I said, I can think of 3 other angles around ethical implications of GPT-3 and the like: carbon cost, AI hype, people claiming it's understanding what it isn't, and then deep fakes or random generated text that no one is accountable for, but for which, but which is being interpreted as meaningful. And then she writes back saying that she's been trying to advocate for this at Google, and she's been sending around my tweets. And people would say to her, GPT-3 is so impressive, etc. And she'd be like, let's see what Emily has to say. And I said, yeah, big data energy. And of course, Timnit had also been working on documentation. She's the lead on a project called Data Sheets, and Margaret Mitchell had been working on model cards. So she says, I'm trying to advocate for documentation first off, and second off, interventionist data collection. And so I wrote back, see Gebru et al. 2018, that's the Data Sheets paper, and ask about what is interventionist data collection. It has to do with actually collecting data intentionally and the way that archivists do. And that's based on some work that Tim Neat has done with Inso Joe. And I'm like, yeah, rather than collecting general web garbage, but doing so in such quantities that you can pass it off as good stuff. And by that point, I felt a paper coming together. So I say I can kind of see a paper taking shape here, maybe not saying that large language models are bad, but rather using them as a case study for ethical pitfalls and what can be done better. Would you be interested in co-authoring such a thing? She said, I'd love to, but thought that maybe I knew more. She wants to see the paper in the world, and then she had to run. And I said, yes, to be continued, and suspected, quite rightly, as it turns out, that she and I had complementary expertise that would make it easier to do this paper if we worked together. So that was all September 8th. 2 days later, I came back with, I'm definitely inspired. I've been thinking about this some more and wondering about a good venue would be. How about FACT, the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference? I have a PhD student who's interested in co-authoring, invited Tim Neat to be on board, though that October 7th deadline was feeling a little tight, and sent her a draft outline. So that was the start of the paper. Actually, one of these notes. So you know what comes next, and I'll talk about that some anyway. But I want to say a bit more about why I'm giving you the history and context of this paper. So 4 more co-authors joined from Google, and the pooled knowledge of us 7 made it possible to actually pull that paper together by the October 7th deadline. And that's also partially possible because it was a survey/position paper. So we weren't doing new experiments or doing new analysis of data, but rather pulling together a narrative out of what was in the literature, including some work that the 7 of us had previously worked on. And so I want you to sort of relate to this paper as just a research paper, as well as sort of what happened. It did clear Google's pub approve process. That's the process by which people who work for Google have to get their publications, anything including blog posts, approved by the company before it goes out in the world. And we submitted it to FACT. And then in parallel, we sent it to more than 30 people for feedback, because we wanted to make sure that we were informed by people who maybe didn't agree with the points we were trying to make or had various investments in building large language models. So I think I've said this by now. The other reason I'm sharing this is that I think it's generally interesting to reflect on the processes of scholarship. And it's worth noting that this is writing a paper in a month like this is not typical. And like I said, that was possible because we were 7 people pooling our expertise and because it was a survey position paper, so that we were sort of ready to go with what we wanted to say. I guess the other fun thing to note about this is that September 2020, everyone's working remotely. Not all of us are even in the same city. This paper was done entirely as an asynchronous remote collaboration. We didn't even have Zoom meetings. All right, so then what happens? In late November, around actually our Thanksgiving holiday, Google asked Dr. Gebru to either retract the paper or remove the Google co-authors' names from it. And she pushed back, asking for information on what exactly was being objected to, and for her part, objecting to how she and her team were being treated. And as a result, on December 2nd, Google fired her. And Dr. Mitchell, who together with Dr. Gebru were co-leads of the ethical AI team at Google, started documenting what happened to Dr. Gebru and calling on people within Google to apologize and fix their systems. That link there is to a wonderful letter that she wrote detailing all of that. Took a couple months longer, but by February 19th, Google then fired her as well. That led to intense media interest, both about Google's treatment of Dr. Gebru and eventually Dr. Mitchell, and also about our research. I have collected the media coverage that I think was good at the link that's there. If you're curious to see more about what went down, at a certain point, like I did a little news search to see who was covering this, and there was a news story on Breitbart, which is a US outlet with like far right views. I'm like, I'm not even going to read that story, but there was a lot of media interest. And within a day or so of Dr. Gebru getting fired, someone leaked the pub-approved version of the paper to Reddit. So this was the version that was being reviewed, and that was uncomfortable. And I've spent a lot of time with the media, and at first it felt very intrusive and very strange to have, effectively work in progress getting all of this attention. But Timnit was doing really powerful, amazing stuff with the media spotlight, and I saw that I had something that I could do to help her. So I was happy for that opportunity, and then sort of understood better how to work with the media through that process. All right, so meanwhile, the paper's still being reviewed. Fortunately, the primary reviewers were able to complete their work before the media story broke. So the paper was effectively reviewed anonymously, which I think is important. The final decisions for FACT were announced on December 22nd, and the camera ready was due a month after that in January. We were still not allowed to include co-authors with Google affiliations. Meg Mitchell had seen the writing on the wall about likely getting fired, which is why she appears on this paper as Margaret Schmitchell, in case anyone was wondering how that came about. So that is the story of how the paper started and then what happened as we were writing it. I think it is maybe ironically amusing that if Google's goal in asking our Google colleagues on this paper to remove their names from it was to not have the paper associated with Google, that failed spectacularly. And I'm not sad about that part, although it's really unfortunate that Google took these actions. I guess the other important thing to note is that both Dr. Gebru and Dr. Mitchell have absolutely landed on their feet. Dr. Gebru is now the director of the Distributed AI Research Institute, whose work I definitely encourage you to look at. And Dr. Mitchell is working at Hugging Face. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the content of the paper and take you through what we found when we were thinking about what are the ethical considerations with large language models and what steps do we recommend to try to mitigate them or mitigate the risks. So we would like our audiences to consider whether ever larger language models are inevitable or necessary, what costs are associated with this research direction and what we should consider before pursuing it, whether the field of natural language processing or the public that it serves in fact need larger language models, and if so, how we can pursue this research direction while mitigating the associated risks, and if not, what do we need instead? So I'm going to do a brief history of language models and then talk about the risks under 4 headings: environmental and financial costs, unmanageable training data, research trajectories, potential harms of synthetic language, and then risk mitigation strategies as the third major section. So as a very brief history, first a definition. So a language model is a system trained to do string prediction, and that might be sort of what comes next, or it might be masked language models where it's somewhere in the middle and the system has access to both the left and the right context while making the prediction. This is an old technology in one sense, initially proposed by Claude Shannon in 1949, implemented for speech recognition machine translation in the early 1980s to quite a bit of success. And at that point, it was n-gram language models, but then we see this evolution through various neural architectures through the transformers. And our big takeaways from this very brief history are that better scores through more data and bigger models kind of for a while, and then scores stopped improving, and then there was a movement to a new architecture, and then there'd be better scores through more data and bigger models, and then you would hit a ceiling effect, and then a new architecture, and so on. Today's multilingual models, as of at least January 2021, had about 100 languages in them. There's work now on model size reduction strategies, both in terms of can we take a model and distill it down to something smaller, but also I think there's some work looking into can we train on less data. And then maybe most interestingly is that as the models got bigger, so did their sphere of application. So it went from just things like speech recognition and machine translation, where the noisy channel model makes some sense, if you squint really hard for machine translation, to things like using word vectors pulled out of language models to be the representations of words in many classification tasks, to what we see today, where people are even trying to use language models as a replacement for search engines. Okay, so how big are we talking about? For those of you at your own devices, this graph might be legible. If you're sitting in the in-person room, just sort of sit back and take the overall shape of it. What we have here is the data set size in the orange squares in gigabytes, and the parameter count in the blue circles, looking at language models starting from BERT here in 2018, going through Switch C in early 2021. And it looked like this was just going to be taking off and shooting off the chart, as it were. I have not been tracking what's happened since then. Yesterday, I sort of quickly scraped together an update, looking at some more current models, so from late 2021 through mid 2022. And it looks like the parameter counts actually have not continued getting larger, unless there's something that I was unable to turn up that was bigger than Switch C. But the data set sizes are pretty big. So on this chart, where the data set sizes are in gigabytes, the information I was able to turn up yesterday was mostly about number of tokens, except for Gopher, where I was able to estimate that that was about 1.3 terabytes. So that is a bigger data set size than anything on the previous slide. And that is one of the smaller token sets in this chart. So number of parameters staying stable in the hundreds of billions, number of tokens, people are trying larger and larger. Okay, so what are the risks? The first category is environmental costs and financial inaccessibility. Climate change is a massive concern, and so we're very concerned about the greenhouse gases, including CO2. Our World in Data says that the average human across the globe, so not people like me in the United States, where we are far larger emitters, unfortunately, but average for a human is 5 tons of CO2 emissions per year. And Struble et al. 2019 looked at what would happen if you trained a transformer model on GPUs, and they came up with 284 tons of CO2 emissions. Now, this number has been criticized as inaccurate so people at Google have said that's not what our emissions are, but Struble et al. Never claimed that. They said, if we use these GPUs on this kind of an energy mix, this is the number we get to. They also looked at how much does it cost, right? So there was their own study on English-German translation where they got a 0.1 blue increase, and they estimated that as costing $150,000. And when it costs that much to even play, there are serious considerations of who can participate in doing this research if it's that expensive, and that's the low end, right? There is, so what can be done about this? So Struble et al. Encourage us when we report research results to also include information about training time and sensitivity to hyperparameters. And they suggest more equitable access to compute clouds, for example, through government investment. So the question to sort of sit with here is which researchers and which languages get to play in the space and who is cut out alongside the environmental costs. So what can be done on the environmental end? One is to look to renewable energy sources, but it's worth noting that those still incur a cost to the environment. And of course, they take away from other potential uses of green energy, right? Solar energy is in principle unlimited, but we need to build enough solar capacity, and we don't have that capacity yet. We can also prioritize computational efficient hardware, and this call has been taken up by the Sustain NLP workshop. And there's also similarly calls for promoting efficiency as an evaluation metric, like in the work of Schwartz et al., and to document energy and carbon metrics so that we can say, okay, we're going to make informed choices here about, do we want to follow this path? Which of these options look like it's going to be more energy effective, and so on. And then finally, this is the main thing that we added in this paper to this discussion about environmental costs, is to think about it in terms of costs and risks to whom. So large language models, particularly those in English and other high resource languages, are going to benefit those who already have the most in society. On the other hand, marginalized communities around the world are impacted the most by climate change. In early 2021, when we were finishing up this paper, we were pointing to how the Maldives are threatened by rising sea levels. In 2020, 800,000 residents of Sudan were affected by flooding. But on the flip side, we aren't seeing large language models being built for Dhivehi or Sudanese Arabic. Although there is, of course, a lot of really wonderful work on low resource languages, including, for example, by the Masakane group. I just want to add that these are examples from 2020, and of course, climate change hasn't stopped, and probably the most poignant and dire example right now is the flooding in Pakistan, where a third of the country is underwater. And again, are we seeing large language models for Urdu? Are the people who are currently unable to farm and having their crops lost because of that flooding getting any benefit from large language models? Probably not. All right, so this paper is a lot of fun, isn't it? Here's the next set of risks, talking about unmanageable training data. Now, you might think that because the internet is a large and diverse virtual space, that very large data sets, such as the Common Crawl, which is described as petabytes of data collected over 8 years of web crawling, and a filtered version of that is included in the GPT training data, that those data sets must therefore be broadly representative of the ways in which different people view the world. But that's actually not true. If you look at who has access to the internet and is contributing, that's going to be already down selected from the population at large and favor younger people and those from developed countries. If you then look at who's being subject to moderation, what we find is that people with marginalized identities are more likely to get pushed off platforms. For example, the work of Jones, not on the slide, but cited in the paper, found that accounts receiving death threats were more likely to be suspended than those issuing the threats. And also Marshall 2021 is a nice meditation on this point. So not everyone's participating in the first place. Of those who participate, the more likely you are to have a marginalized identity, the more likely you are to be precarious on a platform and get pushed off. And then we say, okay, well, what parts of the internet are being scraped? Well, Reddit, Wikipedia, and so on are very prominent in these data sets. Reddit skews male and skews young, and Wikipedia also skews heavily male. And the sites with fewer incoming and outgoing links like blogs are going to have less connectivity to the places where these scrapes are starting and therefore be less likely to be included. And then finally, there's the step of filtering. And there's this really amazing story about this list that gets used to filter out, do sort of a first pass filter to try to get rid of pornography and hate sites. And, good thing to do. Like, I'm glad they're doing that. But it needs to be done more carefully. This list actually started off life as part of a website for streaming music, where the developer wanted to make sure that these words were not going to, these 400 words in English were not going to be showing up as suggested autocompletes in the search bar. And then it got picked up as a way to filter out websites in general and from these data sets. Basically, if they contain these words, then that website is out. And the problem is it includes words like twink and other things to do with various LGBTQ identities. And so we end up filtering out online spaces where people who inhabit marginalized identities can speak about them in positive ways. And so that's again going to skew the data that's there. So in general, a large data set is not necessarily diverse. Furthermore, as Birhane et al. 2021 point out, machine learning applied as prediction is inherently conservative. That is, we are going to be using the past to affect the future by making classification decisions or generating text. We have this risk of value lock, reifying older, less inclusive understandings as society changes and those changes are reflected in language. And our example here is the Black Lives Matter movement, which led to an increased number of articles on shootings of Black people by police on Wikipedia, which is good. And not only were current events getting documented more, but past events were also documented and updated. And so a language model that didn't capture all of that is going to have the views that it's representing in its distributions less informed by movements like Black Lives Matter. Also worth noting that media doesn't cover all events and tends to focus more on dramatic content. So though these things maybe do get better over time, it is still a slow process. So language models encode hegemonic views, and retraining / fine-tuning would require thoughtful curation of data to figure out how to do that fine-tuning. There's a nice proof of concept from Slime and Dennison 2021. Okay. Once you've got that data that is not representative and is furthermore locked into older value systems, it's going to encode bias, right? And there's a lot of research now in probing language models for bias. And Blodgett et al. 2020 have a great critical overview of that. Documenting this problem is an important first step, but is not in itself a solution. And the automated processing steps involved in documenting and then maybe eventually filtering or fixing may themselves be unreliable. There's interesting research on that, citations in the paper. And furthermore, if we're going to do probing for bias as a step towards fixing these things, then we have to know what social categories the language model may be biased against. So we need local input before deployment, because it's going to matter to the people who the language model is interacting with in whatever way or making decisions about in whatever way, that the biases that are relevant in that group are sufficiently addressed. Okay, so we ask in the subtitle of this paper, can language models be too big? And so people frequently ask us, okay, so what's the limit, right? How big is too big? And I don't have a number for you of either parameters or tokens, but what I have is a methodology. I think you should be budgeting for documentation and only collecting as much data as can be thoroughly documented, because documentation of where the data comes from, so whose text was that, who's speaking, how was it selected, how was it filtered, and so on, allows you to understand the sources of bias and work through potential mitigating strategies. If there's no documentation, then there's a potential for harm without recourse. We've adopted this term documentation debt to describe cases where you have data sets that are both undocumented and too big to document post hoc. Okay, more risks. This is category 3 to now research trajectories. Research time is a valuable resource. I want anybody in the audience who's a researcher or gets to spend time doing research to really think about how valuable and precious that time is, which means we should be thoughtful about how we allocate it. And it seems to me that focus on language models and achieving new state-of-the-art scores on leaderboards, particularly those that are supposed to be measuring natural language understanding, is maybe misdirected research effort. Because language models have been shown to excel due to spurious data set artifacts. And so sort of empirically, even in Cow and others have shown that these successes are often illusory. And theoretically, Alexander Kohler and I wrote a paper in 2020 making the point from the perspective of just linguistic theory and the notion that languages are pairings of form and meaning, and language models only get linguistic form as their training data, so they don't have access to meaning. So given all this, are we actually learning about machine language understanding down this research path, or is there a better place to allocate our efforts? All right, fourth category of harms is the potential harms of synthetic language. And the first point here is we as humans just can't help ourselves but interpret language when we see linguistic artifacts in a language that we speak. And it's really interesting, I think, here to look at the psycholinguistics literature on human-human interaction, and in particular, human-human linguistic interaction, because we find there that it is co-constructed and leads to a shared model of the world. So when peoples are speaking to each other, we are working together to achieve a joint understanding. Text generated by a language model, on the other hand, is not grounded in any communicative intent or model of the world or model of the reader's state of mind. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to say that that language model doesn't understand anything, given the increasing fluency of text synthesis machines. But we have to keep in mind that when we encounter that fluent text and it seems like the machine is understanding, we have to remember that we have a predisposition to interpret locutionary artifacts as conveying coherent meaning and intent. And if we don't account for that predisposition as we are evaluating what the machines are doing, we're going to end up evaluating what we're doing, but putting it on the machines. So finally, what do we mean by the phrase stochastic parrots? A language model is a system for haphazardly stitching together linguistic forms from its vast training data without any reference to meaning, a stochastic parrot. Nonetheless, humans encountering synthetic text are going to make sense of it. So coherence is in the eye of the beholder, and that's going to lead to a bunch of risks. Before I get into those risks, I just want to say, yes, I know parrots are smarter than that. And this metaphor is a little bit unkind to parrots, but I do think it's evocative, at least around the activity that we imagine parrots are doing when they can be trained to repeat human words. Maybe sometimes they're doing that for cause and effect, but they aren't doing it with understanding of language the same way that we understand the language when we hear it from them. Okay, so what are the potential harms that come about when humans encounter synthetic text that they then make sense of? So there's denigration, there's stereotype threat, there's hate speech. These are all cases where you get harms to a reader or harms to bystanders when they come across biased or toxic language that has been synthetically generated. Also, cheap synthetic text can boost extremist recruiting. So this is a study by McGuffey and Newhouse from 2020, where they looked at whether GPT-3 could be used to populate message boards on extremist recruiting sites and make it feel like there's a lot of people there. So when an actual person comes, it seems like there's a large community for them to join. And they found that, yes, it could be used effectively for this purpose. Another example is when language model errors are attributed to a human author machine translation. So there's citation in the paper, a striking story out of Israel-Palestine where a Palestinian man was arrested because he posted a picture of himself on Facebook with the caption in Arabic, "Good morning," and it got automatically translated to, I think, variously kill them in English and hurt them in Hebrew or something. And nobody bothered to check that that translation was accurate before arresting the guy. Fortunately, he was only detained for a day, but that did not need to happen. Also, and this is a case where it's actually not about people being fooled by synthetic text, but something else, which is that language models can be probed to replicate their training data and disgorge personally identifiable information, which is a problem. And then language models can function as hidden components in things like query expansion and other things to do with search. And then we see all of the types of harms that Sophia Noble documented in her book, 2018, Algorithms of Oppression, where all of the biases that have been sucked up by the language model are amplified and sort of returned to the user as, oh, this is just how the world is. And we really would not like that, I think. So these harms largely stem from the interaction of the ersatz fluency of today's language models, together with the human tendency to attribute meaning to text. They are deeply connected to the issue of accountability, because synthetic text can enter conversations without anybody being accountable for it. Accountability is key to both responsibility for truthfulness of the text and to situating meaning. And there's this wonderful quote here from Maggie Nelson: "Words change depending on who speaks them. There is no cure." And what I take that to mean is that when we encounter synthetic text, we are going to imagine a speaker of that text and use that to situate the meaning. And the way in which we do that imagining is going to influence the way that we understand the text. And that's important and really important to account for, coming back to accountability. And one test that I like to have for this claim that language models, the synthetic text is ungrounded in communicative intent, is to say, okay, who's responsible for that? If GPT-3 or one of the other language models says something, who has the accountability for the truth of it, and who should be interpreting as having said it? And I think it's pretty clear that the answer is nobody, because there's no there. There is no communicative intent, but that needs to be made plain so that when people encounter the synthetic text, they are able to appropriately contextualize it. Okay, done with all of the bad stuff until I get to my update for 2022 at the end. Let's talk about what can be done about this. The first thing is an exhortation to allocate valuable research time carefully. I think we should incorporate energy and compute efficiency in planning and model evaluations. So that's foregrounded throughout, rather than just saying, oh, hey, this would be a fun experiment to run, and then kicking something off that uses a lot of energy. We should be selecting our data sets intentionally. And I love this quote from Birhani and Prabhu, inspired by Ruha Benjamin: feeding AI systems on the world's beauty, ugliness, and cruelty, but expecting it to reflect only the beauty is a fantasy. So if we want to be generating things, we want to run systems in a generative mode, then we need to think carefully about what we feed them. We should be documenting process data motivations so that there is a chance for accountability and recourse if harm is being done, and also a chance to sit back and think about, okay, is this a good system to deploy in this use case? And in doing that, we should think about potential users and other stakeholders. There's a methodology called pre-mortem analyses, where you consider worst cases and unanticipated causes before you build the thing and before you deploy the thing. And there's a lot of methodologies from value-sensitive design that can guide developers through identifying stakeholders, that is, people who might be affected by a system, whether or not they're directly touching it, and identify their values and then design to support their values. It's also worth asking, is there risk of backing off from this path, right? We're advocating slowing down, but what are we giving up if that's what we do? And so we, in the paper, think about the case of improved auto-captioning, because there's definitely benefits to that. And so then we say, well, are large language models, in fact, the only way to get these benefits? What about for lower resource languages or time and processing constrained applications? We're going to need other solutions there. Or if we do need large language models for auto-captioning in certain cases, are there other ways that we could mitigate the risks while still supporting these uses of language models? For example, is there a way to watermark synthetic text so that it can't be running around undetected in the wild? And then finally, are there policy approaches that could effectively regulate the use of LLMs? And I think that no expert on the EU AI Act, but I think that some of these policy approaches are getting debated now. So I'm going to end this main presentation of the paper with the same questions that I started with. Are ever larger language models inevitable or necessary? What costs are associated with this research direction, and what should we consider before pursuing it? Do the field of natural language processing or the public that it serves, in fact, need larger language models? If so, how can we pursue this research direction while mitigating its associated risks? And if not, what do we need instead? Now, I'm not quite done because I thought I should add a few slides about the view from 2022. So has the development of large language models and tech that's based on them slowed down? No, I don't think so. Has data and model documentation become more mainstream? I'd say yes, but there's definitely more that can be done there. I think we're starting to see model cards, data statements, data sheets, oftentimes sort of there in a perfunctory kind of a way, but that feels like progress, progress with more progress to come. Have people become more aware of the risks of this technology? I think yes. I think that's one of the benefits of this paper having been turned into what it was turned into by Google and the press attention, and also the work of many other people. But I was at a really interesting talk last week or earlier this week by Anna Lauren Hoffman. She's at UW's iSchool. The talk was at Berkeley's AFOG group, where she noted this language around balancing risks and potential. There's a lot of now corporate language around AI technology that talks about balancing risks and potential, which Hoffman said sort of absorbs the message of these risks and neutralizes it, sort of saying, well, yeah, there's risks, but now it's balanced against the potential. And so there's still some work to be done, I think, around taking the risks really seriously and getting to a place where, hey, no, let's not build that, is really treated as a viable answer. Not necessarily the answer, but something that is seriously considered. Have the tech companies cooled down on the AI hype? Of course not. So here's a screen cap from one of Google's things talking about how they're going to replace search, the set of 10 blue links or whatever, with a dialogue system based on a language model. Chirag Shah and I have a paper from Cheer earlier this year talking about why that's a bad idea, both from sort of the NLP point of view, because that's not what the language model is doing, but also from the information search sorry, that's his side of things. There's a word for it that I'm losing. But when people have an information need and they go to a search engine, there are various affordances there that are going to be cut off by using dialogue systems instead. And that's outlined in our paper. Here's Cohere.ai as of yesterday, where they say large language models, our models have been trained on billions of words, allowing them to learn nuance and context. Oh, wow. They actually changed that before I got this first screen cap. All right, I have another screen cap on Twitter where it was massive language models, and it wasn't learn nuance and context. It was understand nuance and context like humans do. And I tweeted about it, and they changed it. And I thought that I got this screen cap fast enough, but it looks like I didn't. That's funny. And then here's something from AI 21 Labs. They put together this bot that was a language model trained on the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's decisions, where you can ask RBG and quote unquote get what she would have said about something. And they had this disclaimer that I thought was really squirrely. They say, is it real? It says, this is just an experiment with AI technology. We wanted to pay homage to a great thinker and leader with a fun digital experience. It is important to remember that AI in general and language models specifically still have limitations. Okay, good. But then they say the model can sometimes give inaccurate or inappropriate responses, which suggests that the rest of the time it's actually giving accurate and appropriate ones. And it's not. So AI hype continues. Have people at large become better at critically analyzing claims of understanding language? Well, I hope so, but I imagine there's still work to be done there. So thank you for your attention. There's the link for the slides once again. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's where I can be found. And I'm now really looking forward to this discussion.